Okay, looks like we're live, you guys. Welcome. Is everybody seeing me okay? Give me well, I guess you can say yes or no, which is great.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks. Welcome, everybody. We've been doing these weekly live virtual events every Thursday in February, and we may continue it into March as well. And Vanishing Boise created a YouTube channel and gathered a lot of interesting videos about topics related to growth and development. And we wanted to have kind of like a watch party to watch the videos and then have a discussion. In the age of COVID, this is the best way to really, get engagement and involvement happening, the Zoom format. So the first two worked pretty well. And then this one is on the topic of the financialization of housing. And so I'll read a little introduction. Usually we've been watching short little video clips. This one is significantly longer. This is more like 37 minutes. It's a little longer to hang onto, but it's really worth it. It's very educational. I learned a lot by listening to it, and I hope that you will too. And then stick around after, and we'll just have an open discussion here on Zoom. So with that, I'm going to read an introduction on the concept of the financialization of housing. Housing is a fundamental human right, a precondition to a safe and healthy life. But in cities all around the world, having a place to live is becoming more and more difficult. However, the subversion of housing and land as social goods in favor of their values as commodities for the accumulation of wealth fuels a global housing affordability crisis, with people spending greater and greater percentages of their income on shelter while living precariously in fear of eviction and displacement. The local working and middle classes have become unable to afford housing in cities. People are being pushed out of their very own homes because living in them has become unaffordable. Young people are getting trapped in a cycle of renting apartments that are becoming less and less affordable. Working class and lower income communities are rent burdened, facing serial evictions and left without a place to live. The high cost of housing pushes people into poverty and homelessness. In the UK and US, homelessness is increasing by alarming rates. More often than before, it's children and families that end up without a home. Even for middle or high income people, the cost of housing eats up a greater percentage of their income. Residents should be able to afford to live in their own cities. This isn't a natural, inevitable development, and people in countries and cities around the world need to realize that the development pattern in their own town is not unique. It's a story repeated from Toronto to Sydney, Hong Kong to Vancouver, London to San Francisco, and now even in Boise. The familiar tales of poor residents being forcibly evicted to make way for luxury investment units to be sold to wealthy buyers. It's a global pattern, a new business model repeated over and over again. A new kind of landlord, a hedge fund, whose customers are not tenants that live in their buildings, but instead are Wall Street and global investors. Housing and real estate markets have been transformed by corporate finance, including banks, insurance and pension funds, hedge funds, private equity, and other kinds of financial intermediaries with massive amounts of capital and excess liquidity. The global financial system has grown exponentially and now far outstrips the so-called productive economy in terms of sheer volumes of wealth, with housing accounting for much of that growth. The world of private equity invaded property thanks to the 2008 financial crisis, and a process that was facilitated by the US government. Rather than helping homeowners who were losing their homes, the government sided with the banks. They encouraged foreclosures to clean up the books, gave the money to the hedge funds and private equity firms, who then turned around and bought the distressed assets to make money. And that way, the 2008 recession gave birth to Blackstone and other massive global private equities who are scouring the world to acquire residential real estate. Words like gentrification are not sharp enough at describing the issue. It's a global disease when homes are turned into assets in a financial game. A hip coffee shop or art gallery pushing out the poor doesn't encapsulate the entirety of what's going on. There are other much stronger forces in action. If citizens and politicians want to push back on the invasion of speculative money from hedge funds and criminals, we need to have a deeper understanding. So with that, I am going to try to share my screen and we'll start the film. Can people see the YouTube screen? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And here we go.
The cost of housing, renting or buying it, seems to go in only one direction lately, and that's up and up and up. And while that's making it tough for many to keep a roof over their heads, it's providing tidy returns to investors, according to a documentary having its Canadian premiere tonight on TVO right after this program. The doc is called Push, and it makes the connection between profits and the affordability crisis. With us now to delve into the details, we welcome Benjamin Tal. He is the Deputy Chief Economist at CIBC Capital. Diana Petromala, Senior Researcher at Ryerson University's Centre for Urban Research and Land Development. Martine August, Assistant Professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. And Sean Hildebrand, President of the real estate market research firm Urban Nation. And we are happy to welcome all of you here to TVO tonight for this conversation. I know that you have all seen the documentary, right, that is airing immediately thereafter. You got a sneak peek. And I think just to sort of set up our conversation and then maybe whet the appetite of the viewers to come, I'd like to get just some initial impressions. Martine, why don't you start us off? What was the sort of most salient fact that emerged for you, having seen it?
I think the main point that they're trying to make in this documentary, which I really took away from it, is pointing to the way that housing, which many of us view as a home, something that ought to be a human right. That's certainly the case that Leilani Farha is trying to make in this film.
This is the UN rapporteur.
The UN Special Rapporteur. The film follows her trying to understand this affordability crisis and this rise of financial investment in housing across the globe. And I think the key point that she's trying to make is the way that we're increasingly seeing housing being treated not as a home, but as a financial asset, as something that's primarily being used to drive profits for investors. And that is having impacts, really negative impacts on people, on communities, and driving affordability and social and spatial inequality.
Good. Sean, what did you take away?
Well, I thought that the documentary did a very good job of humanizing the issue. So I think really the point was, when you go through massive housing booms like we have globally, there's going to be collateral damage, and there's going to be unintended consequences. And being able to tell the stories of the individuals who have been impacted the most by this, I think was really powerful. I particularly enjoyed some of the statistics that they showed. As someone who collects data, I thought that the documentary did a good job of kind of telling a story with sort of human cases as well as using some of the data. I think perhaps what I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more is a little bit more focus on some of the policies that have been tried in the past to help correct for the housing affordability situation that we have across the globe. The documentary ended on an optimistic note in that there's a lot of these conversations that are starting to be had really across the globe. And we can kind of triangulate that back to what's happening here in Canada, where the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments are all sort of talking about affordable housing now and making it the top of their agenda.
Diana.
I found it really interesting in the conversation dividing housing or talking about housing as a social good and not a financial asset, whereas here in Canada we treat it as a financial asset. So there is predominantly our housing supply comes through some form of investment and profit seeking, either whether it be developers in development or investors coming in building purpose-built rentals. Someone's investing in that asset with the anticipation of making a return. We can't expect them to do it for free, and the government spends very little on housing. So I'm not sure why we expected outcomes to be any different in that environment. I do feel that there are some challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities with the financialization of housing. One being a lot of our rental stock now is coming from some of this international investment, and the construction of purpose-built rentals is now at the highest level since 1992. So
Coming back big time, isn't it?
yeah, and a lot of the developers, if they want to build a development, they rely on that investment in pre-development stages in order to get their financings. They have to sell 80% of the development before they can get their financing. And 50% of those condos that they're building is being added to the rental stock. So it is a really important factor helping to drive supply now. So I worry about penalizing it when it's actually there's opportunities from the financialization of housing.
Speaking of financing, shall we hear from the banker?
Yeah.
Okay, Benjamin, your view.
First, I think it was a wonderful documentary, and I think that viewers should stick around and actually watch the documentary. It's a beautifully done documentary. It tells a story. The human face of the crisis we call real estate at this point. We also know from this documentary, this is not just about Toronto or Vancouver. We are not so special. It's everywhere. This is very important to understand. I totally agree with Sean that what's missing, and maybe that was not the purpose of this documentary, is solutions. This is a very good tale of the problem without discussing potential solutions.
That's going to be our job over the next half an hour.
Absolutely, but it was a wonderful documentary.
Good, okay. Well, let's whet the appetites a little bit more, shall we? Here is a short snippet from Push, on immediately after this program. Sheldon, the clip if you would.
A new owner came and took possession of the building. They were breaking locks for the main entrance for the building. They were physically pushing their way into people's apartments upstairs.
I hear stories of nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters who are unable to afford to live in the city where they're supposed to be guarding and helping. I'm giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy.
They came after her with the hardest category they could. The neighborhood's getting gentrified. It's moving. It's come right up to King and Dufferin, and it's only one direction into our neighbor, and we're in the way.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is if only. It's much deeper than that.
Housing has become overly financialized. So it's like gold. But gold is not a human right. Housing is.
Now, you may have seen this chart right at the very beginning of the clip, and if you're listening to this right now on podcast, let me just describe it a little bit for you. It's a graph. There are two lines on the graph. The bottom line is wages, and that is essentially a straight line across. The second line is home prices, and that one is on a 45-degree angle, and you can see that as time goes by, there is an increasing mismatch between what the price of a home costs and what people earn and are therefore able to afford. We've got a couple of numbers here we can add to that. The average family income has risen by 133%. The average home price has risen by 425%, this in the Greater Toronto Area. Again, you see the mismatch that goes on here. Benjamin, let me follow up with you. If housing prices are rising so much more quickly than wages are able to purchase, what does that tell us about the state of the housing market?
That is unsustainable. That's what we know. But the issue is the word average. Average wage. As we know from high school mathematics, it doesn't tell you the whole story. We know that the income gap in Canada, in the US, in Europe is widening at a rate we haven't seen before. That's the main issue. The focus is always on debt, how much debt people take in order to buy this house. It's not on income. The debt to income ratio is at 170%, a record high. Everybody in Canada knows this number. I think it should be part of the citizenship test or something. But the issue also must be income. Income in Canada is not rising. 20 years from now, when people study this Great Recession and the big expansion that we have, they will realize that what was defining this expansion is not Trump, not even trade. It is the demise of the wage mechanism. Many people are able to buy real estate in Toronto and Vancouver because they have the income, but many people cannot. The mismatch that you were talking about is a mismatch in the labor market. People without jobs and jobs without people. This income gap is actually being revealed in the real estate market, where people that can afford it buy expensive, and they can do that. But many people cannot do that. That's the story.
Sean, since you're the data guy here, I want you, if you can, to tell us, do you have any idea what percentage of people are buying homes to live in and what percentage are buying homes as an investment vehicle?
So within the condo market, for instance, where most of investment activity is focused, about 35% of the entire condo stock is investor-owned. Within that, about 14 to 15% is foreign-owned. And actually, an interesting stat is that about 5% of that stock is actually empty. And you can sort of relate that back to one of the interesting stats from the documentary that showed that 80% of properties in London were foreign-owned.
Wasn't that map
and they
shocking?
Were empty. And they're empty.
Actually, can we see that? You got that standing by? Let's play that right now, since you've touched on that, because
Sure.
when you see that map, that is really an astonishing thing. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that one too.
This place is now a bit of a dead zone. We have very little indication of who the owners are. And a lot of them are completely empty, so you can't go up and ask them who they are. They're actually just empty all the time.
Now, that's in London, UK, where 80% of the properties are empty. And again, if you're listening on podcast, we're looking at a map of the City of London around Regent's Park, and there are red dots scattered all over this map. It almost overwhelms the map. Are we far away from this in the Greater Toronto Area?
Yeah, I don't think we're there.
We're not there.
No. Certainly we have a pretty high percentage, particularly in the downtown core, of condominium units that are owned by investors. It's probably closer to about 50% when you look at a downtown condo building. But as Diana alluded to, we've been almost entirely relying on these condo investors to supply rental units to the market, because we haven't been building traditional market rate purpose-built rental housing to any sort of notable quantity for 35 years. So basically what you see is that when a condo reaches completion, fully half of the units go directly into the rental market. And they're absorbed very quickly. But what we're recognizing is that even with all of this condo building that's been happening and all of this condo investment that's been occurring, it hasn't been enough to satisfy demand because the rents keep rising. The average rent for a condominium in Toronto is $2,400 a month, and it's risen by 30% in the last 3 years.
For what size apartment?
This would be 650 square feet. Yeah, so maybe a 1 plus 10, a 1 plus 10, something like that. A two-bedroom would run you closer to around $2,800 a month. And we've been relying on these condo investors to continue to do this. The issue is that we sort of view this as somewhat precarious supply, in the sense that you're relying on mom and pop investors to supply rental units to a population that's seeing the highest levels of rental demand that we've seen in a generation. And when we look at the financial situation of these condo investors, they're barely breaking even on a cash flow basis. And the situation is only going to continue to become more challenging as prices continue to rise.
Let's stop there for a second. Sure. Diana, can you talk to us about what you think the implications of that math are?
Of prices continuing to go up and then housing continuing to become unaffordable.
Of all of what he just said, particularly as it relates to lots of empty units. They're owned, but they're sitting empty. 5% of the units there are empty. I mean, we got people who are looking for places to live, and we've got lots of empty units, and people can't get in. Anyway, implications of all of this.
And I think there's, again, productive and unproductive investment in the housing market. And so vacant units are definitely unproductive, and the government needs to figure out how to get those back on the market. I think implications are we're seeing home ownership is moving out of reach for a lot of people in the region. And we're seeing now higher income households that would have been homeowners are eating up what would have been affordable supply for households in the rental market. So the average income for renters is rising faster than the average income for homeowners. And that's not because we're seeing employment gain, because we're seeing higher income households staying in longer or going into the rental market when they should be in the homeowner market. And that's crowding out people who have lower incomes. So it's coming at the expense of people who can't afford who could never afford home ownership and were in the rental market because it once was more an affordable option. So it's becoming more of a challenge now to provide that affordable housing. So the financialization, we talk about the financialization of purpose-built rentals. Why are they doing it? They're doing it because they can. They can turn these units around and charge $2,400 for a 1 plus den.
For 650 square feet. That's amazing. Do you want to pick up on that? Or what do you see as the implications of all of this?
Well, sure. If you're building new rental supply and it's going to cost $2,400, that's not addressing the affordable housing crisis that we have. And it won't, because the investors that are doing this purpose-built rental are doing it because they want to charge those top of market prices. So I think it's disingenuous to argue we need more supply if there's not going to be any controls on those prices. I'll also say that a lot of the rental housing that we're looking at here in the GTA and across the country isn't new purpose-built, it's the old stuff that was built in the 60s and the 70s. And that is being financialized too, which gets covered in the film. She talks about companies like Blackstone, private equity firm. But we have lots and lots of financial vehicles in Canada that are acquiring and in fact consolidating ownership of existing multifamily rental stock. And the strategy that these owners are using in order to drive profits for their investors, I should say, really rely on driving up rents for people and ultimately rely on pushing people out of their homes. The biggest way that these companies make money for their investors is what they call unit turns. Taking a unit where somebody lives, getting it vacant, and then driving that rent up.
Because in Ontario, you can raise the rent pretty much as you like if you can get the old tenant out and the new tenant in.
Yes, it's called Vacancy Control, something that was brought in by the Harris government in 1997. That created this tremendous incentive for these types of firms, real estate investment trusts, private equity, other types of financial vehicles to acquire and consolidate ownership of multifamily housing. They did it specifically to take advantage of vacancy decontrol, seeing it coming down the pipeline, and we've been seeing rents going up ever since then. And we've been seeing the transformation of neighborhoods. I mean, we just saw a clip from Parkdale. That's a place where lots and lots of buildings are being acquired. People in those buildings, working people who lived in that community forever, have a connection to those places, are finding that their landlords are pushing them out, raising rents. And then the next person that comes in, the gentrifier, they're also being gouged. And so those, I think, are the natural allies of the tenants that are being displaced.
But let's understand, Benjamin, a bit of how we got here. What role did low interest rates, historically low interest rates for the last many years, play in where we're at today?
It was basically the main reason why we are seeing what we are seeing, because we know that for the past 20 years, interest rates have been going down and down and down for many, many reasons. Demographics, people are getting older. We look at Japan, interest rates are negative there. Europe, interest rates are negative, and we are very low. So clearly the demographic story, people getting older, is a main factor. Inflation expectations went down. Therefore, interest rates going down. So that will remain the case. That's not something that will change tomorrow. And therefore, we have to get used to this kind of situation. Now, when interest rates are very low and all those big financial players are looking for return, and the GIC will not do, so what do? You look for alternative investment, which is real estate. So real estate has been king over the past 20 years, and it will remain a very attractive investment given low interest rates. So that's how we got there. The demographic story and low interest rates is the main factor. Demand for real estate is rising and rising and rising, and especially in Canada, where immigration is so significant in terms of playing a role in the demand equation. So all those forces are here to stay. Going back to the issue of rent, we have to distinguish between affordable housing and housing affordability. Affordable housing is clearly a market failure. People need a place to live, and the government needs to provide this kind of assistance. But I'm talking about the other part of the equation, namely young families trying to buy a house in Toronto. They simply cannot afford it. And that's why I believe, and we can discuss it maybe, that the next wave of real estate in Toronto, to an extent in Canada, is actually renting as opposed to owning. I think that at 70%, we have reached the peak of home ownership in Canada, and I think that you will see more and more people renting, and we will start changing the way we view renting. Namely, you are 35 years old, you are married, you have 2 kids, and you are renting, nothing is wrong with you.
That's an okay scenario.
That
Martine,
will
what's
be
your
the
view on
case.
that?
Yeah, I think lots of people are renting. I don't have any problem. I know that we have a home ownership ideology in North America that sometimes stigmatizes renters as not quite there yet in their housing career. I disagree with that. I think renting is fine. However, we just see the prices going up and up and up. That $2,400 figure is so high, people can't afford that. And so what we need, I agree with Benjamin, we need more government investment in housing. We need rent controls. We need to make it so that people can afford to stay, live in the city where they work, raise their families in places that they love.
Having said that, Sean, tell me what it is about whatever makes Toronto magic at the moment, that it is such a supremely wonderful place, apparently, to invest in real estate.
Well, if you look at housing prices, historically in Toronto, they've only declined 1 year in the past 22 years. So basically, you've seen almost uninterrupted growth in housing prices for almost a full generation. And now we have basically a generation of home buyers that have only seen the value of real estate rise, and they've seen only record low interest rates. So it factors into their psyche that investing in real estate is a very wise decision. Now it's the fact that 70% of all household assets are actually in real estate. We also have seen immigration levels rise above 100,000 a year in the GTA. We have one of the, or if not the fastest growing economy in the country. So job creation has been exceptionally strong. We see immigration coming in and boosting housing demand to the point that we're seeing demand for rental housing at 25,000 units a year. We're building maybe on a good year between the condo rental stock and the purpose-built rental stock, maybe 10 to 15,000 units a year. So there's 10,000 units a year that we're not getting. So the rental development industry is starting to recognize this, and we're starting to see some progress made on supply. We have about 14 to 15,000 units under construction, which may sound like a lot, but there's 75,000 condos under construction. So it's still a very, very tiny portion of overall housing development. But one of the things that we noticed happen after the provincial government removed rent control for anything newly built going forward is that we saw a 40% spike in proposals coming in for new purpose-built rental developments. So now we have close to 60,000 units in the pipeline. I can tell you from the work that we do on doing market feasibility studies for rental developers, there's probably another 50, 60,000 that's planned ahead of that. So we're going to get there eventually. The problem is that a lot of these units are located downtown. The rents are relatively high. But one of the magical things that you see happen when more supply comes into the market is that rents begin to stabilize. And we're starting to see that right now. This year in Toronto, we'll see the highest level of apartment completions that we've seen probably on record. And because most of those condos were bought by investors, they'll go directly into the rental pool. Some of the stats that I'm seeing over the last 6 months suggest that rents are actually flattening out. And as that happens, you begin to see a filtering effect down to the rest of the marketplace. We're also starting to see more development applications coming into the suburbs where the rents don't need to be $2,400 a month.
Well, let me pick up on that with Diana. There is a tendency when you live in Toronto to think that this is the center of the universe and whatever's happening here is happening maybe everywhere. I want to know in the province of Ontario, is it basically a Toronto phenomenon, but everywhere else it's normal?
No, I think that's the interesting part about Ontario is that prices are rising just as quickly outside of the city, and the gap between rents within the city and the rest of the Greater Toronto area, if you include Hamilton, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, don't vary by that much. Like you're not going to be spending less by moving to, say, the York region, and then now you have to add the commute in because all the jobs are in the city of Toronto, which is why I think you saw a lot of the demand. What is interesting now, though, is we take it for granted that everybody does want to be in the city of Toronto, and we are starting to see millennials, first-time home buyers, and other generations, other age groups also leaving the city of Toronto. We have intra-provincial migration, which is people moving within the province. Shows that people are actually leaving the city of Toronto and the Toronto CMA for other areas in Ontario. Like they're not even staying within sort of that general commute area. They're going beyond what we call the Greater Golden Horseshoe.
And those decisions are made overwhelmingly because of housing reasons.
Yeah, you can chart migration flows with housing affordability, and as home ownership has been going up, you've seen the opposite trend, people leaving the region.
How are they doing that? Because presumably if they needed to be here, it was because there was a job here that required them to be here. If you're moving 2-3 hours away, you can't take the job with you in many cases. So how's that working?
Well, actually, the most interesting is that Ottawa seems to be benefiting from inflows, and Ottawa has is the region with the lowest unemployment rate across the country. So they're moving for affordable housing, but I think they're also moving for job prospects elsewhere now.
Is this happening in Ottawa as well?
Or the financialization of rental housing?
Yeah, this whole
Absolutely,
story.
yeah, it's happening all across the country. You can see this in the major markets in the GTA, Toronto, Vancouver. You can also see it filtering down to secondary, tertiary markets, mobile home parks, the far north, resource communities. These types of financial vehicles are rapidly acquiring multifamily housing, rental housing across the country, and applying a series of aggressive property management strategies to drive greater returns to their investors. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a strategy that really gets those profits don't come as if from magic. they really come from the pockets of the tenants living in those buildings. There's really only so many ways that you can raise value for your investors. And the value that's being raised is for the investors, and it's coming from the tenants. So what we're seeing here is this sort of wealth transfer. It is almost mirroring the broader transformation of wealth that's been happening with financialization over the last couple decades. This is the type of thing that Thomas Piketty talks about in his book Capital. This is the type of thing that the Occupy Wall Street were talking about, this shift in which you have the 1% increasingly growing wealthier while you see working people's wages stagnating. And so we see that happening now, where people who are living in apartment buildings are seeing a greater portion of their income go towards investors who are pooling their capital and buying these properties.
If you would like to see us transform into a society where you can be in your mid-30s, have a family, and live in rental accommodation, and that's just fine, then presumably we want to start introducing policies to ensure that there's going to be a lot more rental stock out there. What have you got in mind?
Absolutely, and I think that purpose-built is a solution. I totally agree that the condo market cannot be the rental market, and the rental market cannot be the condo market, because the new wave of renters, and that's the reality, are going to be families with kids or baby boomers that will be downsizing. Both of them don't want to deal with a landlord. They want to deal with a company, stable, and they need this kind of arrangement. Therefore, increased supply of purpose-built apartment building is crucial for the solution to the real estate crisis we are facing. And therefore, we need to make sure that people are getting used to the idea. So we have to change expectations when it comes to housing. It's not just you graduate, you get from university or not, you get married, you have 2 kids, and then you buy a house. Now maybe you will be renting, but we need to make sure that the supply is there. The unit size must be relevant to families. So we have to rethink the way we supply, and governments can play a role here by, let's say, allowing those builders to actually make money out of this development.
So what policies do we need to make sure that happens?
For example, you can reduce development charges. You can actually give them a break on HST. There are many, many factors or tricks that you can come up just to increase supply. Sean was talking about some increase that is happening. I say that's not enough. We need much more than that. That's a solution to our crisis.
Reducing development charges, does that not mean you're going to have fewer parks, fewer daycare spaces in the neighborhood, fewer amenities in the neighborhood?
Well, that's the trick. We have to find a real practical solution to the issue. We need more supply, and then try to come up with a way to live smarter. And we can do it with technology. So I think that that's the direction. We need more supply. The issue is not demand. I'll tell you one thing. I was in Ottawa the other day, and some people are starting to talk about reducing immigration as a solution. We are an aging society. We need new immigrants. We'll need them more than ever
so you don't like
future.
That idea.
So I don't think it's a good idea, but it's basically a sign of desperation. And one more point about that. If we don't fix this housing issue, we will not get those 100,000 coming to Toronto, because they will go somewhere else. Because at one point, they will say Toronto is not a city we can live in, because the infrastructure is not there, housing is not there. That's not good enough. So we need to attract them, not to reduce the number. And the only way to do it is to make sure that housing is affordable, and rental is the solution.
In which case, Martine, ideas. How are we going to put the policies in place that will encourage more purpose-built rental?
Yeah, I think the financial investment by these types of firms into purpose-built rental and into acquiring the existing rental isn't really solving the problem. So what we've seen happen over the decades is more and more investment in luxury housing that's where people pay expensive rents. We haven't seen prices falling. In fact, it's been the opposite. So I think there's an argument out here about how we need more and more supply. It's an argument that's really favored by developers. And we don't see that magical, we don't see it filtering down, and I think the idea of filter down economics was debunked years ago.
Okay, in which case, what have you got on offer?
I'm saying that that the government actually shouldn't be subsidizing real estate investment trusts and private equity funds with government-backed lending, providing them with those low rates, and then allowing them to drive this affordability crisis, pushing people out of their homes and raising rents in an affordability crisis. So I don't think that CMHC, for example, our federal housing agency, should be giving these people the access to the cheap financing so that they can keep worsening the problem.
Okay, you've told me twice now what they shouldn't do. What should they do?
I think that they should build, social housing. This is what Benjamin is saying. We don't need to have this middleman that's making the profit
I don't think he was saying that. I didn't hear him say that.
Okay, let me. I don't mean to
Sorry,
put
go
words in
ahead,
your
go
mouth,
ahead.
but what I should say is that we haven't tried this in a while. We've had decades and decades in which we've had the federal government step away from providing social housing. The private sector has not swept in and provided us with affordable housing. In fact, we've just seen prices get worse and worse and worse, and people are getting squeezed. So what we need to do is have the government, which has lots of money, invest in social housing. I'm not talking about low quality social housing. I'm talking about wonderful, net zero emissions, social housing that's destigmatized. That would be an interesting and innovative solution that we could try. And we haven't tried it in decades, and we haven't seen the private sector come in and provide a better solution.
You don't look all that excited.
No, I think that social housing is definitely the right thing to do, but social housing will not solve the problem because social housing is dealing with the margin of society that are struggling, and we need to help them as a society. So I totally with you on this one. But social housing is not the main issue. The main issue is middle-income families with 2 kids that cannot afford housing in Toronto. That's not social housing. We need to help them as well, and that's where you need the supply. So we have to distinguish between those 2 forces.
Martine?
I would just say on the supply thing too, the other thing we need to do is stop the rents from going up. If we're so worried about affordability, don't allow companies to gouge families anymore. Implement actual rent controls. I think what we need to do is also prevent there from being loopholes that allow landlords to raise rents through above guideline increases in which you can charge back the cost for major capital repairs onto tenants. Really cut that off so that rents will stay low, so that people will have security of tenure, so that they can stay in their communities. And I will just say, because I can anticipate the response that I'm going to get from economists on this, which is that, in 1991, we had this rent control was removed on anything built after 1991. Let's go back and look at how much got built. It only started very, very recently that we started to see, there was decades and decades and decades in which the private sector could have capitalized on the magical incentive that was going to be provided by removing rent control. Didn't happen.
Well, they weren't in 1991 because it was the worst recession since the Great Depression.
It's been a while, and we've just seen the start of the investment. And guess what else? We're seeing, federal government investing in private multifamily rental construction right now, and we're starting to see a little bit more public incentive for that. I think if the federal government has money to put in building purpose-built rental, it should be built for social purpose. I believe that we talked earlier about whether housing is a social good. I think it should be. I believe people are coming around to that way of thinking.
Let's get some wisdom from this side of the table. Okay, Sean, some ideas from you.
So first, I think, just kind of going back to that 1991 exemption. So one of the big reasons why developers didn't start building rental back then when rent control was removed was because there wasn't really much rental demand growth. Actually, on a net basis, we were losing renters for a good couple of decades. And the reason behind that was that there was a big push to put renters into the home ownership market, right? We saw CMHC introduce things like 40-year amortization, 0% down programs, and we saw this massive run-up in home ownership during this period of time. However, 15 years later, we're at this point where housing prices in the GTA are 107% higher than they were 10 years ago, and now we're starting to shut out a lot of renter households into the home ownership market. So I think some of the things that we're starting to see happen, like public-private partnerships that are seeing, the City of Toronto release 11 transit-oriented sites that are, mandating to include 50% of the units as affordable housing. The other 50% being market rate is helping to sort of bring in more
that's
affordable
social housing. That's housing with a public spirited mission, right?
Yeah. So the rents are about 80% of the average tenanted rent, according to the CMHC average. So they're probably 30-40% below actual market values.
So
today.
that will go some way to dealing with some of these issues?
Yeah, I think a little bit. If we see more and more of that happen, on the provincial side, we're seeing provincial lands being opened up to developers, and then there's a bit of a rebate or market rebate on the land because there's also affordable housing component, 30% of the units being affordable housing. So these initiatives, I think, are starting to help on the margins. But really, I think going back to what Benjamin said, we just need more market rate purpose-built rental supply. And I do think that there's an argument that even if that market rate supply comes in at $2,300 or $2,400 a month, there's been a lot of empirical research that has shown that it does help calm rent growth for the rest of the marketplace, right? Real estate is priced on a relative basis. It's very simple. So when the top end of the market begins to slow down, you start to see that happen across the rest of the market. One of the issues is that with rent control, people don't move. People don't move as often. In Toronto, we have the lowest level of rental turnover in the country. 9% of people are moving on an annual basis.
And why is that?
Because they're locked in. at their rents that are only growing by 1% a year. So I think there's an argument that can be made that, yes, rental control plays a role in a market that's become relatively unaffordable like Toronto, but there's also an argument for maybe it being a little bit more dynamic and allowing rents to grow by a more reasonable rate, so you don't get into situations where the landlord is not doing repairs on the units because they can't make economic sense of doing so in some cases, and the rents are allowed to grow in line with their costs, which could be, inflation plus 1% or 2% or something like that.
Diana, a couple of minutes to go here. You got some ideas you want to share?
Well, yeah, first I just want to point out, yes, the region is building a lot, but I think we're underestimating the demographic impact of aging of millennials, and they are wealthier and moving into their high income earning years. So there's a lot being built, but we still can't accommodate for that demographic shift. So, and if you look at a chart of rent growth versus vacancy rates, so vacancy rates are how many units are sitting empty, there is a direct correlation. So I do think that supply is part of the answer. So yes, we're building a lot, but we're still not meeting demand. In terms of social housing, it's a great goal, but it's also quite expensive. So we look at a place like Vienna where they make sure that everybody has an affordable place to live. 60% of the population live in in housing that has been supported by the government. But the country itself devotes 3% of GDP to housing expenditures. And I'm not sure, like the federal government here, if that's a realistic outcome for the government here in Canada. So in the meantime, if we can't get that, we do need more supply. And I think, regulation, not all regulation is good. We need to start looking at what is productive and what is unproductive. So if we think about these areas that are gentrifying, particularly, let's say the city of Toronto, why then is the municipality or supporting or allowing gentrification of poor neighborhoods, but then protecting wealthier neighborhoods with zoning rules and keeping development out of those areas?
We got a lot to chew on here today.
Yeah.
I want to thank all 4 of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Diana Petramala from Ryerson University Center for Urban Research, Sean Hildebrand from Urban Nation, and on the other side of the table, Martine August, the professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo, and Benjamin Tal, Deputy Chief Economist, CIBC Capital Markets. And of course, we urge everybody to stick around and watch Push, the documentary that that kickstarted our conversation here, in which the 4 of you all gave 2 thumbs, or I guess 8 thumbs up if we add them all up together. 8 thumbs up to. Thanks, everybody. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back. Can you hear me? Am I showing up on the screen? Okay, I'm getting some head nods. Okay, I forgot to preface that. So there's this really fantastic movie. Unfortunately, its broad release got interrupted by COVID, and I found a tiny window of time where you could watch it online, but I can't find a way to watch it. It's apparently streaming in Canada, but not in this country, called Push. And you can watch a preview of it online, and as soon as it's released streaming somewhere, I'll let you know. But it's the UN's special rapporteur on housing made this film, and it's really, like they said in the interview program, it's a really great illustration of financialization of housing, and it puts a human face on what's going on. And so obviously it was being showed in Canada that night, and so they were talking about the film. And then the other thing I meant to preface it with was that I searched for this topic, financialization of housing, on something in the United States, some news program, a video, something someone's done, and honestly, it's just not something we talk about in this country, I'm finding. And so this was obviously an interview show in Toronto, Canada. So they made reference to local issues there, local laws, etc. But you can just, supplant what they said there for the United States and for Boise, the Boise metropolitan area. So I hope you were able to figure that out as the video went on. So I just wanted to set that up and then just, open it for discussion. So do folks have observations or statements they want to make about the video? Did they learn something interesting or shocking. So people can jump in. If it gets really rowdy, then we might have to like have folks raise their hands. Don't be shy.
But there was a major difference actually, which I found interesting. They kept talking about purpose-built, rental housing versus condo, which took me a little bit to figure out. In this country, we don't build any quote unquote, not in Boise anyway, condo as it's called, which I assume it means sold to individuals, like it typically means colloquially here. And then, so I guess what they were talking about was condos being sold and then individuals renting them out. And as supply, and they were saying about 50% of those then become rentals versus purpose-built, quote unquote. Now here, it's what, like 95% is purpose-built, and we hear the reason for that is because the liability issues, and it's more expensive. So it's more expensive to build, quote unquote, condos here. And one of the important things that they don't bring up there is that, at least in this country, supposedly, you can't go from a purpose-built rental ever to having it sold as owner-occupied for liability reasons. It's the construction is too shoddy, apparently, which has kind of, I think, big impacts long-term on a city. You can't trickle down, right? You can't trickle down purpose-built apartments to owner-occupied apartments at lower rates as the markets may change or whatever. I shouldn't say trickle down, but you just can't convert. You can't adapt it unless you perhaps had massive remodeling, which probably would never pencil out. So that's an interesting thing, right? So they were talking about kind of, again, this acceptance of what we heard during the Great Recession, like, oh, everybody should become a renter. It doesn't make any financial sense anymore for people to own their own houses. Wrong. Certainly if you could have bought one back then, it would have made wonderful sense. But if it becomes impossible, essentially, for all of this new purpose-built housing ever to become owner-occupied, I think it's a huge kind of stamping the future of a city with the current economic conditions. And it's something generally you hear planners caution against. Don't lock yourself into a certain kind of housing type or a certain kind of market response far into the future. And people will argue, well, that's the problem we have now with all the single family housing, et cetera. It seems like we're likely doing a similar thing, locking ourselves into something that can only give us kind of deteriorating purpose-built rentals far into the future. Anyway, I'll shut up. But that was pretty different than I think what we're seeing here.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Richard. I think that's a really good difference between, apparently there may be less litigious country than ours. And for people who may not know this, because it was pretty shocking when I first learned that condo construction has more stringent building codes. Walls need to be thicker. Just kind of, the building has to be more stout, and several ways that increase costs. And so in order to have that pencil out for a developer, usually the only condominiums I can think of that have been built in Boise lately are like really high-end upscale. Like I'm thinking of the Afton condominiums across from the library. I think they were like at kind of fading a little bit on the exact price, like $645,000 when they came online. They're probably $100,000 more than that now, because that was a year or two ago. And then the other thing is that there were lawsuits where you had sort of an obvious class action with all the residents of a condominium or owners of a condominium that would sue for issues, and then that made developers and bankers more nervous about financing condominiums. So that's why we only see single family houses that now in Boise start at $435,000, and we see, corporate investor owned rentals for the most part. Other observations or comments?
Can you hear me, Lori?
Yeah, we hear you.
On the left side of the screen, the data guy from the real estate industry,
right,
talked about the magical issues and the trickle down. What you never hear them say is he does all that data. They'll do just as much data when they start to see vacancy rates go up, and then they'll stop building. So this whole notion of we just build more,
right?
They will watch to see as soon as vacancy rates start to show more vacancies, they'll stop building.
Right.
So it's important to point, in any conversation when someone says we build more, well, they're going to watch the data just as closely on that side and pull back just as fast.
Right. Yeah, the bankers and basically the growth industry, the solution is always build more. We just need more supply. But yeah, he conveniently didn't mention that really shocking, I guess that was mostly about foreign investor owned. They didn't have a map of the vacancy, but they did talk about a vacancy number. I can't remember what it was, but shocking numbers of vacancies that exist around the country. And so that's, wealthy people just buying apartments to either launder money, to have it be like a ATM machine for appreciation. They're just buying it to watch, the prices go up and then sell it. And then the real estate investment trust, and, even an empty apartment that in an appreciating market yields a lot of income. So, but yeah, he didn't mention that. And then of course the Airbnbs. I just find it phenomenal that we don't talk about how the Airbnb is now the largest hotel chain in the entire world. And I don't know, is it like 2013 when it was founded? It was not that long ago. So in an incredibly short time period that it became that. And so we just don't talk about how that creates so many like vacancies and conversion of housing stock for local workers into basically hotels for visitors. And so that's a huge contributor to the vacancy issue as well.
Lori, have you seen anything in any city where they've been able to moderate that? Because I know you and I have looked at over there in Garden City where they built those skinny, smaller units, and immediately, like 2 of them, immediately were bought and became Airbnbs. So, the fact that, if our city says, oh, if we do these, if they just get swooped up right away because someone else has the money to make it that, those small homes aren't gonna fix anything either. So have you seen anywhere that any city has been able to, especially with Idaho being so restrictive? I mean, I don't know how we can stop that.
Are you talking about vacancy or are you talking about Airbnbs?
Well, I'm talking about trying to control that from happening to, because you can't tell someone what to do once they've bought that house. So you could have someone say, oh, I'm going to buy it and live in it, and it's a total lie, and they could buy all of them.
Yeah, I guess I'm not 100% sure about the answer to that, but I'm thinking of like the housing trust fund that the city is building housing on the city's property. And then in order to sell it, if you owned it for a while as an individual and you wanted to sell, if in fact they are going to be owner occupied and not rentals, and I'm not sure on this first proposal they have on tap whether they're going to be, but in the model of a housing trust fund, then you basically lose the appreciation of the land, right? Because you're not selling the land, you're just selling the structure on top of it. And so the way these housing trust funds usually work is that you can have like a small, modest appreciation that you can use to sell to somebody else. But I don't know that you can put it in writing that they can't then turn around and turn it into a rental. And you're right. In fact, I just saw one of those neighbor works. I don't know, they call them like cottage courtyard type of like little individual houses in Garden City. I just drove by one the other day on Adams Street, and it had a for rent sign in front of it. And I thought, that's a bummer, because they were like, very modestly priced. I think when they were built, they're around $200,000, I think, 2 or 3, maybe 4 years ago. And so whoever got that now will just have the appreciation, and they aren't going to like turn it around or turn it out for another family to buy to live in, right? And so, and then the other thing that it makes me think of is like with deed restriction on ADU units on property, the city can deed restrict it so that one of the units has to be owner occupied. Now, how much enforcement of that happens, I don't know, but like, that is one thing that the city can utilize its power to do. So why not restrict it so that you have to live in it or sell it if it were, in a situation that you mentioned. So, and do other people have answers to her question? And then there's a whole thing about vacancy control. And honestly, I don't really know how it's structured, but there is such a thing. And it is one of the policies that's pushed to deal with this issue around the globe. I'm not sure it's gotten much traction anywhere, but if you are interested in it, definitely Google it. It's a whole thing. Do other people have questions or thoughts about the film or observations?
If you find the push video anywhere again, definitely repost it, because it's worth watching.
Yeah,
it is eye-opening.
Did you watch it?
I did when you had it posted for that like 2-week window of time that it was free.
Yeah.
And available out there. Yes.
I know. How do we get people in elected office to watch it? That's the key, right?
Yeah.
I feel like people in elected office should not be, casting votes about housing and our housing market if they don't understand this huge force that's at work in housing, nationally, globally. And so we need to get this information to them, because I am not sure that people fully grasp it. It is new, and it is kind of this giant economic model that people may not see that it impacts their lives, but it does. Like, it impacts us here in little old Boise,
Well, and this, I pulled the data. You saw where the Idaho's pension fund is invested, and the elected officials at the state, county, city level, you're deciding on housing, and in the end it's coming back, and Idaho itself is invested in pension funds and REITs, that it's almost self-serving. It's almost like, and I benefit of the doubt, I don't think many of these elected and people are making these decisions actually have looked and seen how that actually benefits them personally when they retire, and their pension fund is built on a lot of that income from all of this.
Right.
It is definitely self-serving, and maybe we need to start pointing that out and recognize that.
Yeah, for people who might not have caught the beginning of that. So one of the major sources of funds for these big real estate investment funds, they're called REITs, I think is how you pronounce it. I don't know if I've got that right. I'm not sure I've ever heard people say it out loud. Are public employee pension funds. So we dug into a little bit of those numbers here for Idaho, the state of Idaho, and yes, they are invested in REITs, and yes, they do get a lot of their money through real estate investments, probably multifamily, quote unquote, apartment investments, around the country, right? And so our state government is invested, and also it shows how it's so difficult to get this thing reined in because, you know, they are really high yield investments. And so don't we want our firefighters and our police and our, you know, dedicated public servants to have good pensions when they retire? Well, yes, we do. But if it's at the cost of our communities and, you know, the collateral damage and externalized cost of poor people and low income people, and, you know, being constantly rent burdened and living in fear of eviction, and the explosive homelessness problem, which, you know, cities around the world are throwing millions, if not billions of dollars at homelessness, but, you know, it's not really solving the problem that there isn't housing affordable for people making less than $20 an hour. That, you know, it's like a endangered species now, essentially. And so the two things are like very disconnected from each other, but they're actually not. They're, you know, it's a cause and effect of, you know, wanting good returns on investments, and then the cost is that it impacts local cities, and then they have to spend more money on homeless services, right? And, you know, and even the police being engaged in, you know, clearing camps, homeless encampments, and a lot more police calls, and ERs getting filled with people who are living on the streets who are more susceptible to disease or violence, etc. Anyway. Yeah, great point though. Thank you.
It's probably worth pointing out now and then that this assumption was clear in this discussion as well. This panel is that this whole thing is driven, of course, by competition among cities to get people to move there. I mean,
Totally.
Either successfully promoting it or just because they've implemented policies, be it, you know, the encouraging the creative class or whatever. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, it's such a fundamental part of how we operate that it's not like we're going to stop doing that. But as long as people are constantly moving around, you could have negative population growth and you could still have affordable housing crises in the places that people wanted to go to, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's not really any solution. You can't just build either. You can't build your way out of it, because then the population will move somewhere else. So it's a perpetual cycle here of creating housing crises, as long as we have kind of the willingness and the kind of the culture and the economic system that encourages mobility and moving around. And it was interesting, you know, in that panel, it's like, oh, well, of course we can't, you know, of course we want more people to come here to Toronto because that's what, you know, that's why we're all getting rich. I mean, so it's not that we're going to change that, but it's, I think, occasionally important to remember that's the underlying issue here. It's not that we don't have enough houses in the world. They're just not in the places that people want to move to. We might not have enough houses either, but that's not what's driving the actual problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole new phase of just exceedingly mobile employees, right? So now with the Zoom boom town and the fact that people can remotely work and bring their salaries from elsewhere, that has put a whole new level of pressure on towns like Boise that are desirable for its high quality of life issues. And it brings folks that exceed the capacity and put incredible pressure on our housing market. So, other folks who haven't talked, do they have ideas or thoughts or questions or?
If no one's gonna say anything, the gentleman on the right side of the screen, who was the economist, you could see him leaning towards what I see what's going to be a rebranding of it's okay to be a renter when you're 35. We're going to shift this whole mentality of, instead of, oh shoot, you have a family and you don't own a house, you're not successful, you're a renter because it gives you freedom and it gives you a sense of community, and you're helping the planet because you're living in density. They're going to rebrand this to be a good thing, but the end result is because it works to help Wall Street. But I can see this, you can see it coming in the way he's phrasing things, and some of the things I've read is they're going to shift this mindset of it's okay to be 35 or 45 renting still. And what I look at is, and when you're 65 and 70 and your rent consumed all your money and you couldn't save anything in your retirement account, and now you just have Social Security, you now are at an absolute dead end. You're going to have rent raising, and your income at retirement won't even cover that. And no one talks about that long-term issue.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it's a huge issue, and there does kind of seem like this coming wave of people that will be totally dependent on rental housing and will be priced out. Literally, their Social Security will not be enough to stay in a place to live, and that we won't allow, old people, masses of old people sleeping on sidewalks. So then again, this is another like externalized cost that we'll be facing in the future, where basically the government's going to have to solve this problem, right? And keep older people, the boomer generation, et cetera, housed. And so I think that is, we're seeing something in the future.
Yeah, that's gonna be really pretty. Big, huge warehouses of very old people, basically. Well, going back to government subsidized nursing homes, but on a massive scale.
Right.
It's not the kind of socialized housing that we probably would prefer, but that's what it's going to be, probably, and it's going to be horrible, I think, personally.
Yeah.
And it will be on all of our taxes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
I was just going to say, and one more thing about the kind of like normalizing being a renter for life. We noticed that happened like right after the foreclosure crisis. It's like, oh, okay, so there's going to be a whole bunch of people now who can't buy a house for 7 years at least, who were foreclosed on. So now we're just going to like try to make them feel better about just being renters, because the system screwed them over. And so, NPR had stories about like, being a renter is okay. And, and it's actually probably just as good as being a homeowner. Like there's no stigma to that, et cetera. And so, yeah.
So just to back up what I said, in terms of the federal government actually knowing this problem's coming, in 2019, there were changes to retirement laws at the federal level because they're worried that more than 40% are unprepared and will outlive their money.
Wow.
So it's not a small number. They know that we've got, big problems coming. And if you only have Social Security and you're a renter and it just keeps going up, that's not gonna work.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna have to rescue people for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and it could be multi-generational because most wealth is inherited, after a parent dies. And if your parent has no money, then you're not inheriting money, and that's not helping you out. And you're in the same situation your parents were. I mean, we really could see a decline in the quality of life in this country.
Exactly. And I just want to point out that's how a lot of African American families are right now, and why they are they have dismally low home ownership rates, because they don't have generational wealth. And so they're definitely represented in higher numbers and poverty levels. So something to think about. going back to the banker, the other point that he kept talking about, besides we just need to build more, is did you hear his other point about it's the regulations, we need to deregulate. So these are like the two main narratives that the growth industry puts forth. One is, this problem that we've created, we can solve it. We just need to build more. And the other is, it's just like all this red tape. It's like these pesky neighbors are slowing us up. Like if we just have, deregulate the industry, then we'll build all the houses that you need at prices that you need. But prices don't go down, they only go up. As we've seen in Boise, we have record-setting building going on, and houses appreciating, what was it, like 30% over 1 year this year in Boise, 30%.
Yep.
I think that's like $100,000 prices went up over 1 year. It's mind blowing. But yeah, that's always the fallback. And, this is also a huge issue that we have in Boise. The deregulation is not just being pushed by the growth industry. We have neoliberals and, urban growth advocates, or urban density advocates, I should say, who are pushing it here in Boise. And we have an entire overhaul of our zoning code happening right now. I think we're halfway through a citizens advisory process, and the conversation is dominated both by those voices on the committee, as well as the consultant who's guiding the process, basically guiding us towards this, build, baby, build, densification, quote unquote, solution. And much of that is predicated on disempowering citizens and from being involved in the planning process, and essentially cutting out citizens' voices from the process, like we saw with the housing bonus ordinance that just passed. Essentially, there are no hearings anymore. The decision is basically an administrative decision that's made between the planning director, who's a developer, and the developer. And citizens will only be involved if they seek it out after the fact, after it's been developed or approved, when there's no leverage, that the city won't have any leverage at that point to get the developer to do anything in the public good. So we're losing our power, we're losing local control. It's unprecedented, and it's happening nationally. This push, this larger deregulation agenda by the growth industry is being pushed everywhere. And so we're just the latest city. And it's not just the people that benefit financially, the growth profiteers, people who are actually in the trades or developers, or the growth elite, people who profit from growth, but it's property rights people, and it's liberal progressives. It's the entire spectrum of people pushing deregulation. So this is one of the chief things that Vanishing Boise is focused on in the coming year, because this overhaul of the zoning code is where it will happen. It's essentially the rule book on developing our city, and it's getting changed. And it's a political process, and the voices that are most heard in that process are the people who are invested in growth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just downloaded Zoom.
Oh, nice. On your phone, it looks like.
I was on Facebook, and I was typing stuff, and nobody was paying attention.
Oh yeah, I see there's some comments there. Sorry.
So anyway, let me chime in real quick. Everything that you're doing and that everybody's doing, unfortunately, the Building Contractors Association got there 2-3 years ago. So all of our elected officials, they're very, very influenced by the building contractors. We all know how powerful of a lobbying group they are.
Yes.
And they're very convincing. I mean, if you sat in through the city council meeting, you could tell they're very influenced by the builders.
Oh,
that
sure.
They've been convinced that we can build ourselves out of this. And I don't think we're going to find out that's not going to work until it's too late. When we have 100 homeless, when we have hundreds more homeless people, oh, locals can't afford houses. Oh, okay. And like I say, the realtors and the developers, they always mention inventory. We've all heard about the inventory. They don't mention that, and I've brought this up before, there's an inexhaustible supply of people wanting to come here. So it's not something we can build ourselves out of.
Exactly.
But if I can finish on a positive note, Channel 7 just last night before had the article on about people that can't afford to live here anymore.
Right. Priced out, I think it was called.
For Channel 7 to run that story,
yeah,
a huge problem, because they usually don't go after controversial, if it's not a feel-good story, they don't want to run it. So just the fact that the 2 TV stations have been running the story, that's a positive thing, that word's getting out.
Mm-hmm.
Word's getting, it's not something that they can ignore anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells me that there might be light at the end of the tunnel, that, there's an election season coming up.
Yeah.
It's going to be the number one issue. I've talked to you about it a little bit. I see myself jumping in, doing something. I'll make some waves. So, and it's stuff like this. All of you that are here on the Zoom, what is it, 5, 6 of us, tell your friends to get involved, because, and that's something else, when it is time to vote here next, people besides people in the North End have to vote. West Boise has to vote. South Boise has to vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can send a message.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we'll probably be involved in some get out the vote efforts, or going around registering people to vote in neighborhoods that don't typically vote, that are underrepresented. And so I hope people are into that and they'll join us in doing that, because I think it's really important. And we have the district elections coming up in 2 years, I believe. So not this, or I guess it's 2.5, right? So it's not this election, it'll be in 2 years after this November election. And so at that point, we'll have people who are representing individual districts that'll align more to different neighborhoods around the city, instead of having 5 of the 6 folks on city council. Well, if you include the mayor, 6 out of the 7 people representing basically 2 neighborhoods. And so that's something for us to look forward to. And I think that will shift the dynamic. But so financialization of housing is a huge issue. We just have a couple minutes more. I want to wrap this up by 9 o'clock. So I'm going to ask if there are other folks who haven't spoken who might want to say something. And if it's crickets, then we'll probably just wrap it up. So Karen, Chase.
I would like to see you remember the map from
the voter turnout map. Mm-hmm.
That turns heads.
Yeah.
Push that map. If most of you haven't seen it, you really need to go look at it. Mm-hmm. Laura, if you could put that back on your Facebook page and show people.
Like it's close to the election, we will.
I've shown that map to 1,000 people and it catches them off guard.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, I had no idea. So push that map.
Yeah. So moving forward, I guess I'll just ask a question. Do folks, can folks make suggestions of ways to expose more people to this concept of financialization of housing? Do they have ideas on how to get the word out about it, to make people understand it, whether it's elected officials or fellow citizens, neighbors, etc., in Boise?
One of the things with our zoning advisory committee that you kind of mentioned as we tend to remove the power of the city to weigh in via negotiating. That's kind of one of the goals, is to get away from, remove the city's ability to negotiate by allowing more by right permitting. You know, that takes away all of this power of deed restrictions, of exaction, all the private property mechanisms.
Yep.
As I understand it, which I'm no expert, but as I understand it, you know, you can do a lot via private property, transfer of development rights, et cetera, et cetera. All of that incentive to do those kinds of things is going to disappear as we entitle more density by right, entitle higher buildings by right, entitle, essentially get away with the CUPs and the variances. So that to me just takes away one of our biggest abilities to influence this financialization of housing or the product, you know, and, you know, because ACHD, you know, a lot of things they do aren't, you know, they have a different philosophy, but that one thing they actually do well is get developers to build stuff for them. You know, it might not be the right things, but they actually do that. Boise just is pathetic in that regard. Anyway, so that's to me is part of the financialization, and we're kind of going the exact wrong way as far as I can tell.
Yeah, great point, Richard. I think that's one of the main things that we'll lose in this deregulation, rewriting of the zoning code process, is that we won't have the chance to negotiate with developers. And yeah, besides the deregulation agenda, national agenda, it's the by right agenda, so that they don't, developers don't have to ask special permission. There's no exceptions to the law. They're just like embedded in the law that they get to do what they want to do. Like, one thing that's been bandied about in the committee apparently is getting rid of conditional use permits. So conditional use permit is, you know, a legal mechanism that what's that?
You condition it.
Yeah, you condition it.
The words say it. You condition it.
Good point. And it's been used effectively, you know, to get something from developers. It's a higher bar that they have to pass, and you know, and in the most egregious examples of bad development, like I'm thinking of the CVS store on State Street, it was the mechanism that was used to defeat a really terrible project. And if they hadn't been asking for a drive-through and needed a conditional use permit, then that store would be built, and, you know, all of that housing would be demolished, you know, and a project that wasn't good for the community, guys, wasn't good for the neighborhood, wasn't good for housing. It would have set a terrible precedent, etc. So these are the things that we lose as a community with this agenda that's being pushed, essentially.
I did ask that consultant because they wanted to know what things should not be, you know, conditional, or which things should be. And so one of the things I pointed out was that trailer parks are conditional in all zones. It's like, technically nowadays, if it's a newer trailer, there's not much difference between that and a typical subdivision. I was like, why don't we just make that allowed in all zones? And he didn't seem very interested in that. Maybe that's not the look Boise's going for. I don't know.
Yes. We seem to be going the opposite direction on our opinions of mobile home parks, unfortunately, which is one of the largest sources of unsubsidized affordable housing in the country, right? So a lot of people in mobile homes, if they lose their homes, they would qualify to be in subsidized housing if subsidized housing was available for them. So a lot of them might end up homeless if they lose their homes. So, okay, on that happy note, thanks for joining me. We're gonna do well, I said we'd do this through February, but now I'm kind of thinking into March as well. And if people have ideas of topics or videos that they know of, shoot me an email, make suggestions. Mostly pulling from our YouTube channel, like we probably have, 15, 20 videos on there already, and just to kind of get more exposure, we're, going through them in this format. And I think it's been good. It's nice to see people's faces and talk in our COVID times. So hopefully we can continue to do it, and you'll maybe come back next week and tell your friends and your neighborhood allies to show up, and let's talk about growth and development in Boise. So
Thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, thanks for showing up.
Thank you, Lori.
Thanks, Richard.
Good to see you every day.
Good to see you guys. Good night.
Bye.